Hi, I'm Logan, author of the upcoming book, The Intensely Casual Guide to Good Story. Last time I talked to you, we talked about why we need a guide to good story in the 21st century. But even before we get to understanding what a good story is, we kind of need to think about what is a story. Now, on some level, you probably think this is a story, right? Blu-ray of a movie, story. Maybe a novel. In this case, To Kill a Mockingbird. It's a book, it's a story. But those are just the media on which the story is encoded. And it's fine to call them stories, but we really need to realize that what a story really is a special state of being, a special experience we have in our brains or our minds that are triggered by those media. So the first thing we need to talk about is at some point in your schooling, maybe even as early as elementary school, you have heard the phrase the willing suspension of disbelief. I'm sorry, there's no such thing. It's actually the opposite of the truth. First of all, the suspension isn't willing, it's involuntary. As Jonathan Gottschall points out in his book, The Storytelling Animal, if I tell you to imagine an old man, you pretty much can't not do it. Almost all of you immediately pictured some version of an old man in your mind. This is an involuntary process whenever you experience a story, as your mirror and your sensory neurons in your brain create the world of the story in your mind, and you experience the events of the story as if they are really happening to you. Moreover, many scientists, as Nobel Prize winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman have pointed out, disbelief is unnatural and requires effort. Our default state is belief. And when you experience a story, you will usually believe it naturally, involuntarily, unless something forces you to disbelieve it. What is truly suspended is our connection to ourselves and our physical environment, as our brain creates the world of the story. What is suspended is reality, not disbelief. At Intensely Casual, we call this state the suspension of reality, or the suspension of the real. And it's a special case of the flow state as described by psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. When engrossed in a story, you forget yourself, and you become one with the characters and incidents of the story. And as far as I can tell, story is the only kind of experience that can put you into a flow state without you being a direct participant in the experience. Like, for instance, playing a game. So what's a story? As Jonathan Gottschall points out, all stories in their most basic form can be described by the equation character plus problem equals story. And what that means is if you don't have a character and a problem, you don't have a story. You have an anecdote, you have a report, you have information, but you don't have a story that's going to trigger the suspension of reality. This, by the way, is why the news reports so little good news. Despite the fact that audiences are at least as long as I've been alive, have constantly complained that they want more good news. Every day, the cable channels and websites provide a list of the most important things that went wrong that day. And even the inspiring good news stories are usually inspirational because of the way someone overcame some problem in their past. In essence, the news consists either of ongoing problems or their occasional transformation or resolution. The only difference between the bad news and the good news is that the good news is related in past tense, with the problem already overcome, whereas bad news describes the problems we are currently having. So that's the most basic form of a story, but there are a lot more things our brains need if it's going to stay involved in the process of creating the suspension of reality. Probably owing to the fact that suspending reality is very dangerous, right? So if our brain isn't getting something useful out of the story, then it's very dangerous to keep you suspended from reality. This is why I side with the scientists who believe that story is probably our first simulator technology. Like, that's the purpose of it, to allow you to learn about something without having to directly experience it, particularly dangerous things. Because otherwise the suspension of reality kind of doesn't make sense from an evolutionary perspective. Now, I spend a whole chapter in the Guide to Good Story on the topic of what is a story. So I'm really just going to cover the most essential basics here. right? Just the most essential basics, because understanding when stories don't give you these things are the most powerful way to understand whether or not a story is going to be high quality or low quality, which is not the same thing as good or bad for reasons we'll get to in later videos. First of all stories are, like I said, it's a character who has a problem, but it's also a sequence of events. It's about multiple events that happen in a specific sequence and generally can't happen in any other order and make sense. This part of the definition goes back as far as Aristotle. Aristotle was aware of this in his Poetics, this issue, that needs to be a sequence of events. Stories need to be plausible. We expect the world of a story to more or less work like the real world we experience, except for those things the story specifically tells us are different. As Aristotle himself pointed out, audiences are willing to accept unbelievable elements in a story, such as the existence of gods, even if the audience doesn't believe in gods, as if they were true, provided it's been properly set up in the story. And this kind of gets at something that happened to me a while back. A friend of mine was telling me a story about his dad, who liked the movie Terminator 2, but thought the scene where the Terminator is chasing John Connor through the canal. So the Terminator's in a big rig truck and John Connor's on a mini bike. He just couldn't believe the scene. Thought it was completely unrealistic. And my friend was like, "But Dad, this is a movie with shape-shifting robots in it. That's what you're going to complain about?" Yes, that is the most human thing possible. Because we all know shape-shifting robots don't exist. But in order to experience the story, we're willing to pretend they might. The problem is there's nothing sci-fi or magical about a big rig or about a motorbike, or honestly, I don't know what he found unbelievable about the scene. But the point is, it's because those elements were realistic when he felt they didn't behave in a realistic way that he criticized. That's a central part of how story works. The last thing I want to talk about is that the sequence of events have to be plausible, but they also have to be coherent. And this means a couple different things. First of all, a series of random events is not a story. The events must be connected by cause and effect, with each event in the story causing the next. The idea is, given what the audience knows from their own experience, coupled with information from the story, particularly whatever setup was done in the story, the events of the story and their conclusion, even if surprising, seem natural. This is the origin of the famous Chekhov's gun rule, which states that if a gun is shown at the beginning of a story, it must be fired near the end. This rule, by the way, works both ways. If a gun is going to be fired in a story, it needs to be shown or somehow introduced beforehand. Now, it doesn't explicitly have to be shown, right? Like if you know somebody's an undercover police officer, we can take from that the implication they might be carrying a concealed weapon. But there must be some reason to expect that there is a gun around if you want someone to use a gun. Now, I have just scratched the surface on what a story is and what makes it work, but this is going to work as our foundation. From here, I'm going to move on to talking about the 3 dimensions of the intensely casual method, starting with appeal. And I'm also going to start mixing in videos where I talk about the stories I'm watching and applying the intensely casual method to them. So we're going to be going back and forth a little bit, sort of introducing you to the ideas of the intensely casual method, as well as how we might apply them or how I use them to evaluate stories. If you want even more of that, we already have my podcast up, the Intensely Casual Commentaries, where my best friend Chris and I watch movies. These are DVD-style commentaries on movies where we watch them and apply the intensely casual method to them. We just published our commentary on my favorite movie, Sideways, and we talk a little bit there about what appeal is and how that creates value and affects our experience of things. Until then, I hope every story you experience was worth it to you.